Today's webinar is about thinking about caregivers. I've also been interchangeably calling it considering caregivers. And the focus of today is to kind of take a look at how we integrate caregivers into the work that we're doing, specifically with an eye on the CANS and collaborative assessment. That doesn't mean that we won't talk about sort of larger issues involved in care management, as well as some of the other tools and other processes that take place, such as the plan of care, the comprehensive assessment, some of the other work that is a part of your job in working with the health home model, and of course, working with caregivers. I am a caregiver myself. I'm a parent of 2 children. I have a 7-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter, and you'll probably hear me use them liberally as examples as we go through today, because I find it easy to use them to illustrate some of the concepts as we go through. I started my career as a special education teacher. I taught in a number of different special education settings, including in a specialized program for children with significant behavioral and emotional control issues. Spent the first 9 years of my career doing that before I shifted gears a little bit and moved into child welfare, where I worked with children in foster care and did a little bit of residential work as well. Oh, hello. If you don't have a question or something to contribute, just go ahead and mute yourself just for the good of the order. So I moved into foster care and support work, did a lot of work with kids and with caregivers, in particular, caregivers who had their children removed from their care, as well as the foster parents who might have been temporarily raising those children. And I spent about 10 years doing that before I moved over into staff training and development. And that's what's led me to this role. I eventually took a role at my prior agency, which was Hillside in Rochester, where I became a regional lead for this CANS Institute and did a lot of CANS training, as well as training on some other internal processes that we had at Hillside. And then eventually I joined this national TCOM team, which is where I work now. And I'm no longer in Rochester. I actually currently live in Boston, Massachusetts. And we moved here so that my spouse could take a job here in Boston. And so I was lucky enough to take a remote work from home job. I took that job last January of 2020. And then about a month and a half later, the majority of the rest of the world became work from home. And so I was leading the trend and getting out in front of it. And we're going to talk a bunch about sort of what this last year has looked like as well for caregivers and for our work in working with kids and caregivers, and sort of what COVID has meant and how it has changed some of our processes and the way that we sort of think about our work. With that, do any of you have any questions before we get started? And it's okay if you don't. I haven't covered much more than my own history yet. So one key thing to know, these Lunch and Learn webinars, we've been doing these for a number of months now, and we pick a different topic each month and try to really do kind of a deep dive into a particular topic. You're of course here for our topic in the month of May, which is about caregivers. A few things to know about these. We want them to be interactive. So yes, I've got some slides. Yes, I've got some stuff prepared that I want to talk about, but I also want this to go in the direction that you lead it. So if there are items in the caregiver section that you are confused about and want a deeper explanation, that's what this webinar is all about. If there are just concepts around how do I get a caregiver involved in the collaborative assessment process, or how do I get them involved in care with their children, that's what we want to talk about today, right? We want to talk about whatever it is that is on your mind. And I hope that others of you on this call, if you have good ideas or thoughts on topics, will chime in and share those. So feel free to chat in while you're here using the chat box. By now, I think we're all familiar with how to do that in the world of Zoom. And of course, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up and ask questions at any time. If you're somebody who is afraid to interrupt, number one, it's okay to interrupt, I don't mind. But if you definitely are just too polite to do so, feel free to use the raise your hand button, which is a part of the Zoom functionality. And a little hand icon will appear above your name while I'm talking, and I'll see it, and then I'll call on you when it makes sense to do so. So and the one last thing on this, we do like to have these webinars be available in perpetuity. So we do record them. Just so you know, even if you go onto camera, you will not be captured as part of the recording unless you are actively speaking. So if you're asking a question and you're on camera, that might be captured. Otherwise, the recordings only capture my slides, and me as the person speaking. So no worries there, but you probably will note the little red blinking light to let you know that this is being recorded. So here's what we want to cover today. You can see some of our learning objectives up on the screen. Again, I kind of already walked through this just a second ago. We really want to explore caregivers today. We want to explore why they're important. We want to explore how important they are to collaborative assessment, why they play such an important role in our collecting of the story of the child's story for the CANS New York. We're going to talk a bit about that caregiver section on the CANS and try to do a little bit of a dive into some of the items that we find are kind of really critical to success. And we're going to review and kind of wrap that up with a Q&A at the end, though again, feel free to ask questions at any time. So let's start with why are caregivers important? This might be obvious to most of us, and that's okay. My hope is that none of you are walking into this webinar today not having any idea what we're going to talk about. I would expect that if you've made it this far into your career where you're on this webinar, that you've got a pretty good idea already of why caregivers are important. But it's always good to refresh ourselves and remember that we are not alone in our thoughts about these issues, right? Number one, right off the bat, is that they're essential to development. We have reams and reams and reams of data that link that you see at the bottom. And I will be sharing these slides with you at the end. So I'll make sure that I get a copy of the slides out to all of you. But this came from the American Psychological Association, looking at really some of the kind of collecting and collating some of the research in parents' roles in children's development, right? We could go on and on and on and on and do hours and hours on just this idea, but we're just going to cover some of the real basics, which is that nurturing and intimate relationship process that occurs between caregivers and between children we see positive evidence to show that does lead to more effective development for the children. Children become more comfortable in their environment. Children become more comfortable in developing and expressing personalities. Children become more comfortable in developing physical skills, fine motor skills. Pretty much every level of development is benefited by effective and supportive relationships with parents, right? So that starts, of course, in infancy and in early childhood. We know that relationships between caregivers and children that are warm, that are open, that set some proper limits and necessary limits for children tend to lead to children as they grow older who have higher levels of self-esteem, who have more positive outcomes in school and in social settings. And generally speaking, we see fewer negative outcomes, right? So we see that there's clear correlative relationships between open but boundaried supportive relationships between parents and other caregivers and children, and more positive outcomes as those children age, right? So that continues through adolescence. We see that caregivers who continue to maintain warm, open, and communicative relationships with preteens and teens tend to lead to higher levels of socially appropriate behavior from those teens. We see fewer issues with using or abusing drugs, and we see lower levels of anxiety and depression when it's connected to those open, warm, and communicative relationships with parents and or caregivers. And probably most importantly, and certainly for programs like ours that tend to support a lot of children who have adversity, we see positive trends in parents of children who come from or are members of communities or cultural or racial groups that might be in the minority, when those individuals, those parents are able to support the children's belonging to those communities, support the children's own personal understanding of their life situation and their personal pride in who they are and how they are seen by the world and how they wish to be seen by the world. This is especially prevalent in communities such as the LGBTQ community that we see when children and teenagers who are expressing themselves as being a member of the LGBTQ community, when they are supported by strong, supportive caregivers who are helping them through that process and supportive of where they place themselves in the world, we see more positive outcomes, better positive self-identity, and it lowers the risk of violence and other negative outcomes. The same is true for children of color, African American children, other children of color. We see that when they exist and are supported by caregivers who help them to really understand their cultural significance, the history, and yes, the risks that may exist for many communities of color in our country and in our culture, that when folks have parents who are supportive and instructive and help them to understand all of those pieces and support them in believing in who they are, that those children tend to have more positive outcomes. Those children tend to have a lowered risk. I will not say no risk, but we will say a lowered risk, right, of negative outcomes, of victimization, and of any real negative outcomes that could influence their development and their moving forward into adulthood. So that was the quick 5-minute version. Again, we could do hours and hours and hours on really exploring these ideas, but we want to move forward and talk a bit more about how does that then fit into our process? How does that fit into us thinking about caregivers through the CANs? The best place to start is, who are the caregivers, right? Who are we actually talking about when I say caregivers or when I say parents, right? So what we always like to encourage you to do right off the bat is talk to the child, right? We talk a lot in health homes about how, yes, the caregivers are important, but the child is our client. The child is the person that we are tasked with serving. And so that's a great place for us to start, right? As we get to know the child that we are serving, the great thing to do is ask them who their caregivers are, right? And we're going to do that in a developmentally appropriate way. The way I ask that question to a 17-year-old is different than how I'll ask that question to a 7-year-old, and different than how I will ask it to a 2-year-old. But ultimately, what we're getting at is, who are the people that provide you care? Who are the people that are raising you? Who are the people that are helping you to have a happy and healthy and resilient life as you move forward into the world? So some of the people that, some of the representation that could be, it could be the parent who lives at home, could be the parent who lives out of the home, could be the foster parent, could be a grandparent. Many of our children either live with grandparents or spend a significant amount of their time being raised by those grandparents. Even if that's not necessarily the house that their head hits the pillow in each night, they might spend most of their time there being raised by that person. The same could be true for aunts, uncles, siblings, cousins, any other type of relation who is providing a significant amount of that caregiving and playing the role of a parent in that child's life. It could be the pre or post adoptive parents, right? Generally speaking, in our nomenclature, we don't, once a child is adopted, we don't sort of call their parent anything other than parent anymore. But this is just our way of kind of recognizing that we are talking about parents who might be adopting children and might be working towards adopting children. Often pre-adoptive parents are also foster parents and then move into that pre-adoptive position. So any or all of these could be caregivers. And one of the important things that we'll talk about here in a moment is that caregivers, we want to rate all the folks who are caregivers for our children on the CANs. So sometimes that's going to be multiple people. It may not just be, right? They may live at home with a single parent, but that parent may work long hours. And so that child, while they might sleep in their parents' home, right, and be parented by a single parent, there might be grandparents that are heavily involved. Maybe they live across town, but that child spends much of their time with that other grandparent and is being raised by them just as much as by the bio parent with whom they live. And so we might consider to rate those two grandparents as well as the parent that child lives with, right? And so each situation is going to look a little bit different, and it's going to allow us to make sure that we incorporate all of those people into our story about the child. So why is that important? Why do we want to rate these multiple caregivers? Well, here's a few of our suggestions for that, right? Number one, it's the idea that we could have actionable needs coming from any of those different caregivers. So in the example I just gave you, that parent, right, who is the person under whose roof the child is living, they may have their own needs. One of them may be they have financial stresses, right? I mentioned maybe they're working long hours because they're trying to alleviate some of those financial stresses. They may have parenting stress as a result of having to work such long hours and not have many chances to see their children, right? So we may see actionable needs coming from that parent, but then those grandparents who maybe are actually doing more of sort of the day-to-day parenting probably have their own needs too, right? And those needs may be different. Maybe financially they're in a different place and that's not a need for them, but maybe there are physical ailments that actually make it more difficult for them to sort of track the children around. I have the same situation in my own life. I have a mother-in-law who I'm lucky enough, I would say, to actually live just a few blocks away from here. She frequently picks up my 2-year-old after daycare and watches her for a few hours so that I can kind of finish my workday before I go and grab my daughter. And she's wonderful, and I'm so thankful that she lives here in town with us, but she's elderly and doesn't move around all that well. And my 2-year-old moves around quite well, right? So if my mother-in-law were being rated right on the cans, we would sort of acknowledge there are some physical limitations going on for her, that it does limit her ability to sort of do all the things that she wants to do with my 2-year-old when she's caring for her, right? That she doesn't take her to a park that isn't well gated, because she knows that if my daughter starts taking off for the road, she can't really get to her in time to stop her, right? So it does change the way in which she cares for my daughter and protects her, right? So we want to rate each caregiver differently because those needs will come out differently for each individual, right? We also want to recognize caregivers are a part of our processes internal here to health homes, right? So caregivers do play a role in the acuity determination, right? There's an algorithm. We're not going to run through that algorithm today, but there's an algorithm that helps determine those low, medium, or high acuity ratings in health homes. And the caregivers' ratings are a part of that algorithm. The same is true for that level of care eligibility algorithm that applies to the HCBS services. There are caregiver items that factor into that as well. So we want to recognize that they are an important part of our processes for making decisions internal to our systems, right? Again, kind of getting back to what I was already saying, different people have different strengths. So even if someone was coming into my home to do the cans and just wanted to rate my own caregiving unit, right? I've talked about myself. I haven't mentioned yet that I have a spouse, right? So I have a wife, and she has very different strengths than I do when it comes to caregiving. And thank goodness, right? Because a lot of her strengths offset my needs. The things that I'm not all that good at as a parent. Luckily, I'm lucky enough to have a caregiver or a spouse, I should say, who can offset those with her own strengths, and vice versa to some degree. So if a person was to come in and do a cans with me and with my family, they would want to rate us each separately because they would want to help us each to work on addressing our own needs and also try to work through our strengths. So that's one of the reasons that we don't rate couples as a single unit. We don't rate, if you came into my home, you would not simply rate us as the caregivers, right? Because some of my needs might be sort of hidden by my wife's strengths and vice versa. One of the reasons we don't do that is we're not always providing care at the same time, right? My wife has a job. She's a hospital physician, so she is not lucky enough to have a work from home job. So she's gone long hours, right, and is working at the hospital. So I might be providing a lot of like the care in the mornings and even in the evenings around bedtime. And so I don't always have an opportunity to draw upon her strengths, right? And vice versa. There are times where she might be solo parenting and I might be unavailable. And so the same situation comes up. So we don't want to sort of rate caregivers as a unit, because we want to recognize that they each kind of bring with them different strengths and different needs. And we want to be honest and truthful about telling all of those stories. And we can also recognize, though, that actually when the people work together, in many cases, those couples actually become stronger when they're able to work together and work through that. Tim, I see that you texted with a question. Feel free, if you want to chat it in, you can chat your question, or feel free to unmute and just ask it.
Yeah, thank you. So in regards to rating parents or caregivers individually, an example I'm thinking of where I see this potentially being a trip up thing. So if I have a kid who says, yeah, my grandparents are also caregivers, and I go to their house, on the weekends, and maybe a grandparent maybe does have some physical challenges and can't keep up with those little kids, but it's not getting in the way of the kids' development or functioning at all. So if that grandparent was the sole caregiver, I might definitely mark that a 2 or 3 depending on the severity. But because they're not the sole caregiver, but I still want to rate them, I don't want to rate them necessarily a 2 because that could be the deciding factor that impacts their acuity to a much higher level, which may not be as accurate. And it could be true with other parents too, like you were saying with you and your wife. Like, granted, if you were the only caregiver, then that it could interfere with the child. But because you're not the only caregiver, for a couple hours, you can make do and the kid's okay, because then the other caregiver comes in. So I guess, I mean, certainly if the caregiver situation changed, we redo the cans anyway. But I mean, because I like to think of it too as, we're talking about actionable needs. Well, just because dad can't do this, but mom can, we don't really have to put anything in place. Sure, we'd like to see dad be able to maybe do it on his own, but I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You're bringing up some great nuance in this. And actually, some of this I was going to get to in a few slides, but I'm glad you brought it up, right? This idea that the items on the caregiver section are meant to be reflective of the needs that caregiver has through the lens of, can they provide the appropriate care to children, right? So when we rate the caregiver section, the caregiver is sort of not our client. Like, yes, they're obviously a part of the client process, and they're the parents of the child who is our client. But ultimately, we're not rating them in a vacuum. We're rating them through the lens of, can they do the job of parenting, right? Can they sort of be the parent or the caregiver that they want to be? And so that's actually the question that I'll frequently ask if I'm deciding, right? Okay, I've got this grandparent. They do have some physical mobility issues, but is it getting in the way of them being able to be the caregiver that they want or need to be in this scenario? So if it's a situation where the kid spends 4 or 5 hours there every Saturday or Sunday while the parents take care of other things, or maybe do some of their work or whatever it might be, and it's not getting in the way of them being the grandparent that they want to be, right? The kids are happy and healthy, and they stay in the house or stay in the backyard or whatever the situation is, and there's no sort of risks that physical mobility presents to sort of providing the appropriate amount of parenting, then I wouldn't rate it. I think you're totally right. Even though they might have physical mobility issues that they maybe are having treated and dealing with in their own life, if it's not getting in the way of them sort of being the caregiver that the family needs them to be, then it's okay not to rate for that. That's totally true. And the other way to look at it is, with the cans, these ratings are meant to be action levels, right? They're meant to represent, are we as a system going to do something to help a family address this need? So if we as a system are not doing anything or have no plans to do anything to support that mobility issue that a grandparent may have because they're dealing with it on their own, or because it's not really interfering with any of the caregiving that they're doing for the kids, then it's okay not to rate for that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. So this chart here, and feel free, the rest of you, if anybody has questions, feel free to speak up or chat in and let me know. So this chart here comes directly out of the CANS manual. So if you have a copy of the CANS manual or the reference guide, then you have a copy of this. This is sort of our recommendation for who should we rate when we have children who might be in the care and custody of the state, of the county, or in some way be involved in either foster care or group home situations, right? So I'm not going to go through this with a fine-tooth comb, but I'd like to just kind of show you kind of how this chart works, right? So in this case, in this column, we would look at, where is the child living right now? Are they living in a foster home? Are they in a group home type situation? Are they living independently, right? Some of our teens are in freed situations or are old enough to be making the choice on their own to be living independently. And then what this tells us, and then what the top columns are asking us is, what is the permanency goal, right? What is the plan long-term for this child? Is it reunification with the original family? Is it to live with a relative as the permanency goal? Is it to be adopted? Or is it what we call APLA, which is another planned arrangement, which kind of covers any other sort of stuff, right? That could be sort of the permanency plan. And then by sort of matching up the two columns, I can see what the recommendation is for who I should rate. So in the case of a child in foster care, who is the intention is for them to reunify, to return home to their original family, I would want to rate, if there are two parents, I would want to continue to rate both parents, right? Even though the child may not be in their home right now, they are still a part of that child's care and ultimately will be the home to which that child returns. So I want to continue to rate, and then obviously take any action that is necessary to help them along in their process. And I also want to rate those foster parents, because they are the ones currently supporting and housing that that child. So there is a very realistic scenario in which I complete a CANS with 4 caregivers, right? The 2 original parents to whom that child will be returning at some point, and the 2 foster parents, right? This will not always be the math, but I think hopefully you see the point that I'm bringing up here. And again, we have similar kind of guidance for each of the different scenarios. Note that there are a few scenarios where we don't rate a caregiver. If we have a child who's living independently and their plan is to continue to live independently, or there is some kind of other arrangement in plan, maybe in a group home scenario, we would not rate a caregiver. We do not rate group home staff as a caregiver, even though they are, of course, providing care and are providing for housing and safety. They are professional caregivers. We don't rate professional caregivers on the CANS. Foster parents, while they are paid, are not kind of classified as professional caregivers. They are effectively volunteers who are being, receiving some remuneration for their support of the system. So we don't consider them to be professional caregivers. It's not necessarily their job. And so we do rate them when children are living in their homes. Any questions on any of that? I know I kind of rushed through that. You can kind of read through that on your own as well. It's in the manual. Okay. So let's talk a bit about how this actually looks when I'm sitting and interacting with a caregiver, right? Generally speaking, caregivers, parents, I will put myself 100% in this category, are pretty proud of themselves and the role that they play in their children's lives. Most of us are sort of able to recognize that we're not perfect, but we also take a lot of pride and believe in the choices that we make and the way in which we are raising our children, right? And so we as care managers or other professionals who might enter the home and work with caregivers and children to try to tell their story, always want to approach it from that avenue. I want to walk into a family's home understanding that they believe they're doing a great job, and they probably are doing a great job, right? And that I'm here to try to understand their story, try to help understand where their needs might lie, and help to address those needs in whatever way I and the rest of the system can, right? So there's a few things that help us to kind of work through that process. Number one is normalizing that the needs exist, right? Those of us who are parents can be pretty good at this because we can actually walk into a home and sort of recognize some similar scenarios that we might see in our own homes and be able to sort of work on the same level as a parent, right? And say like, oh man, I get how stressful trying to figure out a daycare can be because I've been there, and let's compare our stories a little bit and kind of work through that together, right? But not all of us are parents, and many of us are parents in very different situations than the folks that we are serving. And so we don't always have the opportunity to bring our own experiences in. But what we do have the opportunity to do is to normalize that many of these needs are common and normal, and that it's okay, and that we're not going to be judgmental in the way that we approach the needs and strengths on the tool. One thing that's always important to remember is we do judge, we're human, we are going to make judgments, but one of the jobs that we have as care managers is to be able to recognize our own judgments and put them to the side where they belong, and then help the parents that we're supporting understand that the ratings on the CANs are not meant to be judgments. And yes, they can feel that way. The items on the caregiver section can very much feel judgmental if all we do is sort of plop down that list of 25 or so items and say, okay, I'm giving you a 2 for supervision, right? That can feel that can really make the chest constrict for a parent to kind of say, you don't think I'm good at supervising my kids, right? And so it's important for us to walk in with a different approach to that idea. If we think maybe supervision should be a 2, we want to normalize that for caregivers and help them understand it's actually really normal for people to need some help sometimes in supervising their kids. This is not a reflection of how good you are at supervising. It's a reflection of the fact that you need some help sometimes, because you're telling me that you're working 2 jobs and you've divorced from your spouse, and so you don't really have that support anymore, and you're struggling to figure out how to sort of make sure your kids are properly supervised, or struggling to figure out kind of how to get your kids what they need so they can keep growing, while also trying to meet these other needs, which are just as important, right? The financial needs and the housing and making sure there's food on the table. So I'm feeling that there is a need for this right now, not because you're bad at it, but because you need some help sometimes at it. So this is why I think this rating makes sense. And now let's work on what can we do about it? How can I help you? How can the system help you a little bit, right? So we want to normalize and help folks understand this stuff is normal, right? Parenting stress. Our data, we're starting to see a lot of data come in that really shows us that one of the items most heavily correlated with the kids' needs going down over time is parenting stress going down over time for parents. So I say correlated, not, and that's different than causing, right? We don't know yet if it's the parent stress coming down that is causing kids to get better, or if it's kids getting better that is causing the stress to go down. It's probably some of both, but it's important for us to recognize that there's a strong correlation between the two, right? When we can help to kind of address kids' needs and when we can help to kind of address parents' stress, we can see those things come down together and lives tend to get better. So it's okay to normalize that. Most of the folks we serve have parenting stress. I've got 2 kids, I've got parenting stress, right? And so the question becomes, how much of it do we have and is it actionable? Do we want to do something to try to address it, right? So that's normalizing. We also want to consider our kids' perspectives. We're going to ask caregivers about their own needs and strengths, but it's okay to ask kids about their caregivers' needs and strengths. I might not simply say, what are your parents' needs or strengths to a child, even a teen, right? Because that can be a very rude way to ask that question. But what I might sort of say is, what do you love about your mom, right? What does your mom do that you really dig? What does your grandpa do and say that always really makes you feel safe and supported, right? And I may also explore a little bit with them. Are there things you wish that they did differently? Right. And sometimes they're just going to tell me stuff that isn't super relevant to the cans, but sometimes they're going to give me something that is, I wish mom was a little less angry all the time. I wish she wasn't so stressed all the time. Right. Those are clues to me that there probably is some parenting stress stuff going on for mom. Right. Maybe there's even an avenue of mom's own mental health that I might want to explore with her. And I've gotten that nugget from talking with the child and understanding their story through their eyes. Right. So we want to consider the kid's perspective when we're thinking about how we might rate for caregivers. I would never simply listen to the child and then rate the caregiver off of that exclusively, but I would use that as part of the story, right? The cans is all about the story is told through multiple perspectives, and definitely the child's perspective is one of those. We also then, as Tim kind of already started us down this route, we want to consider the impact on the provision of care. So when we're rating this caregiver section, I'm going to walk through the items with you in a minute. When we rate this caregiver section, it's always with an eye on, does this get in the way of caregiving, right? They may have needs that are not really interfering with caregiving, right? And so if they do, we don't have to rate for them. So as we already talked about, if there are some maybe medical issues going on and the caregiver sort of needs to be working on those, but they're not sort of getting in the way of caregiving, then I'm not going to rate for them. I'll use myself as an example. 3 years ago, I suffered an injury pretty traumatic to my knee. I tore my ACL, my LCL, I broke some bones. I was on crutches and in and out of surgery a few times. And so for a few months there, I had significant physical limitations. At the time, my son was 3 going on 4. My wife was working overnights at the hospital as part of her program. And I was struggling. I could not provide proper care to my child, right? I was, in and out of surgery, which then meant, being on some painkillers. I was immobile because of the big immobilizing cast on my leg, and I was on crutches. And so at that time, if a CANS was done on me, I would have been a 3, right? In some of those items related to because it was significantly hampering my ability to care for my child properly. Right. And be the parent that I wanted to be. And I was lucky enough and privileged enough to sort of be in a scenario where I had lots of family and community resources that helped to get me through that. Not every caregiver will be. Right. And so things like that, some of these needs can be temporary, can be significant to the moment that we are in, and we want to work through that. But if I had, maybe just had an elective surgery on my knee and I was kind of hobbling around for a couple of weeks, but was still sort of able to be the caregiver that I needed to be, and I was just a slightly slower version of me for a few weeks, I might not have rated for that item because it might not have been significantly impacting my ability to parent. Right. And also we want to consider that strengths are really important too. And we're going to talk in a minute about how some of these items, even though we're going to rate them as needs, that some of these items can also be strengths. And we'll talk about that.
I got it to work.
Joaquin, I am seeing that you chatted something in. Oh, sorry. Damn. No problem, Joaquin. I'm glad you made it in. Not a problem at all. All right. So here's the caregiver needs and strengths domain. It is long in terms of the cans. I think it is the longest domain on the cans in terms of the number of items that are on there. But every item is really on there because it does represent sort of different needs and different types of strengths that our caregivers can experience. In the interest of time, we're not going to go through every item. I have another slide here in just a minute that is going to go over some of the items that we sort of prioritize as being really important to talk about. That being said, if any of these items are sort of jumping off the page at you going, I've never understood that one, or here are some situations that I've been having recently with some of the families that I work with, and I'm trying to figure out how to rate them, or if it should be this item or that item, feel free to ask those questions at any time, because we do want this to be tailored to your needs and to what you want. But these are the items, we rate them as needs, right? So what that means is, we always want to start at the zero being no evidence of something being a need, right? We always kind of start from there with needs items. So if we don't see any evidence, if there's no clear, nothing telling us that this is something we ever want that we need to work on, then we give it a 0. That doesn't mean there isn't a need, right? No evidence doesn't mean that there's no evidence out there at all. It just means we haven't uncovered any evidence. This could be true, especially early in our cases with families in that first 30 days where we're still kind of getting to know them and they may not trust us and want to really share everything going on in their lives with us, right? So something might be a 0. And then we sort of, as we get to know them after a few months, we realize actually that was probably a 3 the whole time. I just didn't know about, I didn't know what I didn't know. So we recognize that zeros may not always stay zeros. And we often see that sort of the second or third cans, the needs are sort of higher than they were at your initial because you've gotten to know the kids and families better. And you now sort of have a more fuller picture of their story. So that's our 0. Our 1 is there's some evidence, or maybe there's a history of this need. We're gonna practice what we call watchful waiting. So we're not taking action. We're not sort of doing something about this in our plan of care, but we're recognizing there might be some stuff there, right? This is a great place to start with caregivers who maybe feel that some of these items are too judgmental, right? I talked about supervision earlier. A lot of caregivers might sort of recognize like, gosh, they could really use some help here, but they may not be ready to hear that or to agree with that. So we might sort of come to a consensus on, can we rate this a 1 for now? Can we kind of keep an eye on it? Can we check back in on this in 5 or 6 months when we do another cans and sort of say, are you still sort of feeling like you've got this? Or do you sort of feel like maybe you could use some help now, right? So 1s are great ratings to use for that. Once we get to 2, we're talking about taking action, right? We're saying, okay, there's a need here that is getting in the way of you being the parent you want to be. It's getting in the way of you sort of living the life that you want to live. And you'd like some help on that, right? So that's a 2. That's we are going to do something as a system. It doesn't mean we're going to write a goal for each and every one of the 2s that appear, but it means that we might start thinking about ways that we can group them up and sort of put an intervention in place that can address a few of these and try to help that caregiver to alleviate some of their needs. That's our 2. And then our 3 is there's a dangerous or disabling need. We need to take action on this ASAP, right? So we have a caregiver who is frequently under the influence of substances and putting their children at risk. Because of that, driving drunk or, whatever those scenarios are. And so we're saying like, yeah, that's like a 3 for substance use. Like there is a dangerous and disabling need here that is putting people at risk, putting children at risk. And we need to do something about this immediately, right? So those are our 3s. It doesn't always have to be sort of that amount of danger. I'm giving you a very, very big example with that, right? But it could be anything that sort of says we need to take immediate action. We need to help and support this family immediately. Those are our 3s. Questions on that? This is hopefully nothing new for you, right? I'm just kind of going through something you've heard before. So what you heard me mention, right? So we call this it's actually the strengths and needs domain. And it's the nomenclature can be a little tricky sometimes because we are going to rate using that needs scale that I just talked about, but also recognize that some of these items can serve as strengths. We don't rate them using the strength scale like we do for some of the children's strengths, but we recognize some of these items, when they're not needs, could be strengths. Right? So things like organization, supervision, resourcefulness, you can see the list there. We have many families for whom, or many caregivers for whom, organization may be an extreme strength for them, right? This is a caregiver who everything is in its place and their schedules are down to the minute and they're getting this kid to dance class and this kid to there and this kid to there, and everything is really well organized and structured. They might have needs elsewhere. Their kids might have needs elsewhere, but organization is a real strength of theirs. So I'm going to consider and understand that I might use that in my plan of care, right? That's a resource and a strength that they draw upon. And so I know that I'm going to be able to help them better if I work through that, right? So if I'm connecting them maybe to a CFTSS service to help their kids out with some of the work, I'm going to make sure when I make that referral to that service that I'm talking to the provider and saying, listen, mom is one of the most organized people that I've ever met in my life. She's got color-coded calendars and charts on the fridge and in her pocketbook for every scenario. You need to make sure that you understand that schedule, right? When you meet her and you visit her home for the first time, check out that calendar on the fridge, understand what's going on, and try to place yourself into that, in collaboration with her in a way that makes sense. So I'm going to work through that strength, right? So we can use some of these items on the caregiver section to serve as strengths, and then we can work through those in our plan of care. And ultimately, our help, the help of the whole system, is going to be more effective when we work through those caregiver strengths. Thoughts about this? As questions come up, feel free to chat them in or just speak up. So I said I was going to dive into a few of the items that we kind of see as being really important, right? And this is somewhat chosen by me as the designer of today's webinar, but also chosen by data, right? We have some good solid data kind of showing us that some of these items are, as I said before, showing up more often for caregivers, but also we see that when these caregivers are decreased, that tends to go right in concert with kids' needs decreasing, and therefore, their life's journey kind of getting that much easier, right? So one of the ones that I think sometimes is easy for us to forget is this self-care and daily living item. And this is one that can definitely feel very judgmental if I simply go in and ask a parent, hey, how are you doing with like taking a shower every day and brushing your teeth, right? That could be a very judgmental approach for me to take. But another way that I can approach this item is really through some normalizing behavior, right? And this is one where I think during the world of COVID, we might have seen some parents that actually have been experiencing some needs here that we might want to work with, right? Folks that the kids are home all the time, right? Schools are on learn from home. My job has become work from home. I don't feel like I have an opportunity to take a shower, right? Because I've always got kids to supervise, or I've got to be on the computer and doing my, tech support job or whatever it is, right? So we do see some parents that might actually be experiencing this as a need that's getting in the way of their ability to be the parent they want to be. I feel like I can't take my kids to the park because I never have a chance to take a shower and to kind of feel refreshed and get myself sort of presentable to go out into the community. And I want to take my kids to the park, but I just don't feel comfortable doing that, right? So like those are ways that this can show up as a potential need for some of the folks that we serve. So that's a real important sort of item for us to consider. Is this a need that can be getting in the way of effective and supportive parenting, right? You've heard me talk a bit about organization and supervision already. I think these go hand in hand. These again are two items that can feel very judgmental. One example that I really like to use on supervision is a case review that I did a few years ago with some folks that I was working with, where we had a teenage girl who was experiencing significant suicidal behavior and had multiple attempts very, very recently. She was a teen, only daughter of a single dad who was raising her. Was working two jobs to kind of be in a financially supportive position, trying to save up money to get her ready to go to college. Everybody who knew this dad called him super dad. He was just incredibly strong as a person. He understood his daughter's mental health and was really supportive of trying to get her through this tough time in her life. And everybody just loved this guy and this family and really wanted to help them. And when we looked at the cans for dad, when we looked at his caregiver section, we saw 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? Super dad. The problem is that it wasn't really representative of the situation going on for him. He was a super dad, but his daughter, because of her immediate kind of mental health and suicidal behavior, needed 24/7 supervision. There needed to be somebody kind of keeping an eye on her and helping her to be safe at all times as we were trying to work through this really kind of significant period in her mental health situation. And so dad was working two jobs. He was a single parent and he needed to sleep sometimes. He needed to go to those jobs sometimes. So the reality was he could not on his own provide his daughter with 24/7 supervision. It just was not possible. It was not realistic. It was not fair to him, right? So his supervision item on that original can said 0 because there was no question he could supervise his daughter. He had all the skills, he had all the techniques and tricks, and he loved his daughter dearly and wanted the best for her. The reality of life was he couldn't do it himself. He needed help, right? So what we really came to understand was he was a 3 for supervision. He needed some help. He needed somebody to be in the home a few hours every night so that he could get a good solid sleep, right? He was sleeping like 4 hours at most because of all this other stuff in his life. But during those 4 hours, he needed somebody to be there just to make sure that his daughter was safe, right? To just be able to like listen in on a monitor and make sure that she was not, engaging in any suicidal behavior as she slept in her room or did whatever, right? And so that was sort of an example of the judgment might have felt like, we need to judge this guy as a 0 because of how good a dad he is. And a 3 is going to say he's not a good dad. He's not supervising his kid. But that's not what the 3 was saying. The 3 was saying is he needed help, and he needed immediate help in order to do his job of raising and supporting and keeping his daughter safe, right? So we like you to consider looking at these items through that lens. They're not meant to be judgments of how good a person is at being organized, how good a person is at supervising. It's meant to be a judgment of how much help do they need with that. Do they need help understanding how to do supervision differently? Maybe. Do they need help just executing the supervision so they can do other stuff that is just as important to parenting? Maybe, right? But those are all ways that we might represent the needs on these items. And so we encourage you to talk with caregivers and to think with caregivers through that lens, right? This is not a judgment of how good or bad you are at it. It's a judgment of how much help do you need at it, and what help can we as a system provide to you. You've heard me talk a bit already about parenting stress. This is another one, right? We all sort of experience some amount of parenting stress. The question is, does that stress start to get in the way of us being the parent we want to be, right? And every one of us, I'll bet, have experienced at some time in our life, be it with parenting or with other stuff, where the stress of whatever we have to do sort of gets so high that we sort of shut down for a period, right? In my life, this has always been around school. Whenever I was in school and I had like a million assignments piling up, I was the guy that would just sort of be like, I'm going to ignore those and I'm going to go play James Bond on my N64 for a while because I'm just too stressed to even get started on any of this, right? That was just college, not nearly as important as parenting, but is illustrative of the same idea, right? Some of our parents might get into a shutdown mode when there's sort of so much going on in their child's lives. I've got to get my kid to the hospital for their treatment. I've got this other kid who's starting to struggle and fail at school. There's just so much going on. I don't know where to start. And I'm just going to kind of ignore it all for right now, right? That's an example of where parenting stress might be actionable, where we as helping professionals can come in and help build up a plan to get better organized and to help that caregiver kind of piece by piece address each of these needs. And just bring that stress down just a little bit. We would never say that a person's going to get to 0 stress because parenting is stressful, but we want to recognize when that parenting stress is enough that it's really causing them to not be as good at being a parent as they would like to be, or at being a caregiver as they want to be. And we would help them with that. And then informal supports, right? You heard me talk earlier about I hurt my knee real bad. I was disabled for a while. I had a lot of informal supports that could help me. Right. I had parents in town that came over and helped me getting my kid to school. My mother wasn't born yet. I had, we had friends in the neighborhood with a teenage son who would come over and cut my lawn and do some of those things that were sort of my responsibility around the house. I was able to access an informal support network. Not all of our caregivers can, right? So again, this is not a judgment on how good are they at building a network. It's just a reflection of where are you right now and what does your network look like? And if you don't have much of a network and you don't have those extra supports, then let's talk about that as a need. And it doesn't have to be because you need them right now. It can just be, do you have this network so when something goes wrong, that network is ready to act and help you, right? And so we can kind of pre-assess for that, right? I didn't know I needed all those resources that were in my network until I hurt my knee. And then I was very thankful that I had built that network over time and sort of had those supports in my community, right? So our job as care managers can be to help a family assess for that now, maybe before things get worse or before the unexpected happens, so that they've got that resource network built up that can sort of jump into action when that's necessary, right? And that resource network can come from a lot of places: family, friends, religious communities, cultural communities, work communities, right? There's a lot of places that can come from. And that's part of our job, is to help work and assess with them. And if it sounds like part of our job is going to be to help them build that, that's action. So that might be a reason to rate this item as a 2, to say, we're going to help you. We're going to spend the next 6 months. We're going to get you a parent advocate who's going to work with you on trying to build this network for yourself, which is actually a great segue into how do we plan for caregivers? How do we actually engage? And what are some of the services available to us to do that? And I know we're getting close on time here. So if you've got questions that have been in your brain and you haven't been quite sure you want to ask them, go ahead and type those in. I want to make sure we get to those here at the end. So as you are doing your referring, you're connecting, you're working on that plan of care for your kids that you serve, you want to be factoring in what are the caregiver needs and what referrals can I make, right? Some of the services that are available within our child serving system are designed to also help the parents, right? Things like a parent or peer advocate. Those are services that are available in some scenarios to the kids and families that we serve. So those are things that I might try to access and try to engage and use as part of my plan to address a child's needs. I might also be sort of trying to engage services that can address parent needs. I might also want to help recognize that maybe parents want to get connected to their own adult services, right? There is an adult health home system. Some of you may have worked in it or may have transferred over to children's. Maybe you're working, have a foot in both worlds. So you may have some familiarity with that. Many of the parents we serve don't know that there is sort of a similar health home style program for adults, and they might feel well served by that and might be interested in a referral to that, right? And so part of your job can be to help make that connection for them and help them recognize that for themselves, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, we always want to build our services for the kids through the caregiver's strengths. So if the caregiver, if one of their strengths is organization, as I already said, or one of their strengths is even financial, right? Then we might recognize that we can take advantage of those strengths to put in services that will work well for them. Maybe one of the service connections we want to make for the kid is to get them more involved in community activities. And there's this great camp that we want to encourage them to sign up for this summer, but they, it's going to cost some money, but, actually this family is in a good financial position. So we might work with them to try to figure out how to make that happen through their own financial resources, right? So there's ways in which we can connect kids to the right services and interventions and work through the family strengths wherever they may exist. Another great resource, you've heard me mention it a few times, is this idea of family and peer advocates, right? There are advocate systems out there, the Families Together FPA system is just one of them, but one that we work with regularly. And in fact, Nancy Craig from this group helped me put this slide deck together, gave me some advice on some of the things that we might want to say or talk about. These groups are great, right? Because they're made up, the folks who fill these roles, who take these jobs, actually one of the requirements to be a family peer advocate is to have your own experience in the system, right? So we have parent advocates who have had their own children go through the various systems in which we work, right? Who have had kids that have received services from the state of New York or from other systems around the country. And so these are folks who have navigated the same systems that the parents we serve now are currently working through. So they're able to talk on that same level, right, with our caregivers and with our parents that we serve and help to work through this process. These folks can be instrumental to you in many, many ways, not just as service providers, but also as information sources for you, right? As you put together your next CANs, as you put together your next assessment, as you try to continue to understand a child and a family's story, if they're connected with FPAs, right, those folks are going to have a ton of information to help you build off of. Also, if they're already in place, sometimes we enroll kids into health homes and there's already some FPA work going on with that child or family. These are folks who help to give us a great leg up on building our engagement and building our relationship, right? I've done this a number of times in my career where I did my first visit with a family, sort of walking in the door with a parent and peer advocate that they've been working with for years. And that person could sort of introduce me and be like, this is Josh. He's great. You can trust him, right? And because that family trusted their advocate, and that advocate was saying, hey, Josh is a good guy, you can work with him. It just bought me 2 months worth of building my own engagement in a sentence, right? They just gave me that leap up. They gave me that head start. I started the 100-meter dash 25 yards in already because they gave me their cachet, right? They gave me that relationship starting point, and I'm absolutely going to use that to earn this family's trust to be able to help them quicker and more efficiently, right? And so take advantage wherever you can of FPAs, make those referrals whenever you think it makes sense and is necessary and appropriate, because these folks can really, really be instrumental in helping kids and families and helping you to do your job even more effectively.